Okay, so we're going to move on finally from elections and talk about social movements, which is a big part of this course as well. So socialist movements involve large groups of people, individuals coming together with a common purpose for a political or a social change. So sustains grassroots organizations, which we're going to talk about, demand reforms and changes in existing socioeconomic or government practices. So they don't like something regarding the economy or the government in the country, and they want it to change. It could be as simple as a law or an economic system. So there's a variety, and we can see we're gonna look at so many examples here. There's a lot of social issues. That's why they're called social movements. There's also a lot of economic focuses as well. They can be large or they can be small. They can be more formal or they can be more informal groups of individuals. They can be more complex organizations so that earn a lot of funding to focus on these issues. And they're very, very specific issues. They're not like political parties that have a wide variety of interests and people. They're loosely organized, but they have sustained significant campaigns in a variety of countries, even in the United States, to support a goal, particularly either the implementation or the prevention of a change in society's structure or the values, such as through policy. So if you're kind of confused, we're going to look at over 30 examples. You're not going to be confused by the end of this. So let's talk about grassroots social movements. Now, what's that star doing on here? We'll tell you what the star means. So grassroots are social movements that exert their power from the local level to the regional, national, or the international level. They work from the bottom up. So it typically starts with a small group of people in a local area, like a city, really gaining their power. So they conquer the entire city. They're not really conquering it, but they're gaining popularity in the city, then the region, then the country, then internationally. They're moving from the bottom up. They're moving up from the grass to the sky. That's why they're called grassroots. They're rooting. So in the UK, we see an environmental conservation grassroots, such as the Extinction Rebellion, that often start with local chapters organizing protests. That can be a very simple way to spread a social message. They can have awareness campaigns and community initiatives. In China, we see grassroots movements that face severe repression, of course, from the government that really controls civil society and dissent. They have the China Labor Bulletin that works to support workers' rights and organize grassroots campaigns for better working conditions, despite them facing government censorship and crackdowns. All right, the star here means that this is important. It means you should know it, okay? So I would write this one down. So in Nigeria, we see social justice initiatives like the Bring Back Our Girls movement. So this emerged at the local level in response to the abduction of schoolgirls by the Boko Haram Islamic terrorist organization. So throughout grassroots activism, this Bring Back Our Girls movement gained a ton of attention globally, both in the country and outside the country. And this led to obviously pressure on the government to take action to rescue the kidnapped girls and combat Boko Haram terrorism and hold them accountable. In Iran, we've seen grassroots that have been vital for advocacy of political reform, women's rights, and civil liberties. So, for example, the 1 million signatures campaign was launched in 2006 to collect signatures in support of ending discrimination laws against women. It utilized grassroots organization tactics just from going door to door. That's pretty local. They used the internet to outreach and raise awareness and support for gender equality. In Russia, we've seen grassroots face significant challenges due to government restrictions on civil society and freedom of assembly. They can't really protest as much. Movements like the pro-democracy group Open Russia have managed to organize at the local level through networks of activists and volunteers. Efforts aim to promote democratic values such as human rights and political reform, albeit in the context of an authoritarian governance. All right, so we're getting to another star one. In Mexico, we've seen grassroots as well over a variety of issues, especially indigenous rights, environmental protection, and anti-corruption efforts. So this is an important one. The Zapatista movement originated in the state of Chiapas in the 1990s. So it's pretty recent, and it emerged from a local indigenous groups. They organized to resist government policies that threatened their land and livelihoods. And these were particularly economic policies, such as joining NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So through grassroots, the Zapatistas brought attention to issues of indigenous rights and autonomy on a global scale. So they got their support locally, and then they went nationally, and then they went internationally. And you can hear about them across the world and what they've done and advocate for. Now we're going to learn about a little over 30 different social movements in our course country, so really nail this in your head a little bit. And it can be a little overwhelming. And I will continue to star the ones that you absolutely need to be familiar with. So when you're studying these for your test or the AP exam, focus on learning these social movements. Okay? Learn how they put in power in their country, or advocated for power, or advocated for the social issue. Have they been successful? Have they not been successful? Have they been suppressed? Have they reached international attention? Look at all of those characteristics here. You don't need to memorize all 30 of these, okay? So don't feel like you have to. If you want to, you can. I'm not going to force you, though. So let's get started. Deep breaths. Let's start with Mexico. We're going to start with the star one, the Zapatistas, or the Chiapas, if you want to call it. It's an uprising in Mexico in response to socioeconomic inequality that would negatively impact the indigenous peoples, particularly due to the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. So NAFTA further exacerbated the inequalities in Mexico, particularly in rural areas that are located in the South. Critics of NAFTA argue that it favored large-scale agribusiness and foreign investment, and it really hurt small farmers and small business owners, and it resulted in a loss of traditionalism and traditional livelihoods like small farming. It also led to environmental environmental loss, environmental harm. The influx of cheap, subsidized agricultural products from the United States, bringing that foreign investments, flooded the Mexican government with cheaper goods than locally grown products that undercut local producers and contributed to greater rural poverty and job and migration displacements. So in January 1st, 1994, NAFTA went into effect, and the Zapatista National Liberation Army was launched. And it comprised largely of indigenous peasants, and they were armed. They launched an armed uprising in their state. They took control of several towns and demanded land, work, housing, food, health, education, independence, freedom, justice, democracy, and peace. A lot of different demands here as a result of these inequalities. They aim to draw attention to the plight of indigenous communities and their downfalls, and they challenged these neoliberal economic policies. They demanded indigenous rights and autonomy recognition. They didn't want to lose this traditionalism that they had. And despite its very much so military aspect, remember they were armed, the movement emphasized nonviolent resistance, grassroots organization, and the promoting of indigenous culture and autonomy. So for the most part, they didn't go out and just shoot a bunch of people. They weren't like Boko Haram. They were not a terrorist organization. They were armed, and they, for the most part, were pretty nonviolent, and this is what they did. And the government did respond with a military, because, they were armed, as well as negotiations, and inevitably led to the signing of the San Andres Accords in 1996, 2 years later. And this promised constitutional reforms to recognize indigenous rights and autonomy and traditionalism and the inequalities. So they kind of got what they wanted. Kind of didn't, but they kind of got what they wanted. And the government, it really failed to fully implement these agreements. So they kind of got what they wanted, but they kind of didn't. All right, let's talk about some other one, just for fun. It'll load. There we go. There is a LGBT rights movement for gay rights and anti-discrimination. They've had significant milestones, though, such as the legalization of same-sex marriage in certain states, and the Supreme Court ruled in 2015 that the states cannot ban same-sex marriage. Inevitably. So, yeah. There's also anti-abortion and pro-life activists, and as of 2023, the Supreme Court has ruled that abortion is unconstitutional. So, this is different from when laws used to vary state by state. Some states had abortions legalized up to 12 weeks of pregnancy, but now you can have an abortion in all states, because that's what the Supreme Court said. There's also teacher unions protesting fraud, corruption, as well as salary or tenure reductions. So they have the National Union of Education Workers, the SNTE, as well as the National Coordinator of Education Workers that have a history of organizing protests and teacher strikes to address these issues within the education system. They include allegations of fraud and corruption within the education bureaucracy. Remember, the education system is part of the public sector in most countries, including Mexico. They also attempted to implement educational reforms perceived as detrimental to teachers' rights and job security, so they're calling for against these reforms, as well as disputes over their salaries and tenure. We also see various groups that are advocating against corruption, as well as the prominence of drug cartels, particularly in the North. They're led by activists, journalists, and victims of violence themselves. They seek to raise awareness about corruption and the effects it has on society and the government. They advocate for political transparency and accountability, and demand justice for these victims of crime and human rights abuses. We've seen movements such as the Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity and the National Anti-AMLO Front that have gained prominence in recent years. These groups organize protests. They conduct investigations of their own. They push for legal reforms to combat the corruption and impunity at all levels of the government. The movement for women's rights demands gender equality in areas such as politics, which has led to changes in their constitution over gender quotas in the legislature. And we've also seen the protests of femicides. If you don't know what that is, it's the intentional killing of women because of their gender. Gender quotas are used to promote gender balance in the political system and their representation by requiring political parties or electoral systems to include a certain percentage of women candidates on the ballots. So they don't have to have a certain number of seats in the legislature, but they do need to have a certain number of women on their ballots by a per-party basis. All right, let's move into Iran, and their movements. First one is START, so it's pretty important. We see the Green Movement, also called the Green Path, for political reform and liberalization. So we've seen protests about corruption in the 2009 election. The protesters included a lot of supporters of opposition candidates. They took to the streets to demand electoral transparency. They were calling out fraud in this election. They wanted accountability, and they wanted political liberalization. They said the election was not fair. It represented a diverse amount of coalitions of activists, students, intellectuals, and reform-minded politicians. They all united to form a coalition in their calls for greater political freedom, social justice, and democratic governance. And they faced very, very harsh repression from the Iranian government. They led to arrests of protesters, violence, and censorship. But overall, the Green Movement symbolized a significant challenge to the status quo of Iran, its election, and inspired ongoing efforts for political change in Iran. People will look back to that movement as a first. We also see the 1 million signatures campaign, which we talked about previously. It looks at women's rights. They seek to collect 1 million signatures in support of a certain petition that demands changes to discriminatory laws and practices that perpetrate gender inequality and discrimination against women, such as legal rights, marital and family law, access to education and employment. They've been restricted in the university systems and from accessing certain majors, as well as protection against violence and discrimination. We also see the May Day protests that are focusing on getting higher wages and better benefits for workers. International Workers' Day, May Day, has historical roots globally in labor rights movements, which is pretty interesting. It's been observed since the early 20th century. If you don't know when May Day is, you probably should. You can look it up. Because I'm not going to tell you, because you should know it, with workers using the occasion to voice their demands for labor rights and social justice. So Iranian workers participate in May Day with protests to demand for higher wages that reflect the increased cost of living and inflation. They also want improved working conditions. They don't want to die on the job, because I'm sure workers' comp isn't that great in Iran. And they also want better benefits, such as paid leave, pension, and health care, provided health care from their employers. Alright, so now we're going to move on to the movements in the United Kingdom. So one that you're probably familiar with already, or you've heard of because it's very recent, is the Leave movement, Brexit. And this was the movement that ultimately led to the UK's withdrawal from the EU, the European Union. It had supporters that saw the European Union as undemocratic and imposed different regulations and the restrictions on the UK, and it limited its sovereignty and ability to govern itself. And this impacted particular issues such as immigration, because they had open borders within the EU, as well as trade, because they had a lot of free trade, and of course, national sovereignty. And this movement resulted in a referendum in 2016, and the majority of the voters, barely the majority of the voters, opted to leave the European Union. And this took a while, it took a few years, but they ultimately withdrew right before COVID took a big hit on the world, in January 31st of 2020. Another movement we see here, another very important movement that we see, is the Scottish Nationalists and the formation of the Scottish Nationalist Party that have made efforts to increase independence, awareness, as well as autonomy growth within Scotland. Yeah, pretty important. And they formed their own political party that's gained some seats in the House of Commons, as well as some other groups that advocate for Scotland and its autonomy, and ultimately become an independent country separate from the United Kingdom. The Scottish independence movement has long historical roots. It isn't that recent. It's been going on for quite a while, but it's really gained its momentum in recent years, particularly with the dissatisfaction that it has with the UK governance, cultural identity, and the divergent political priorities that Scotland has that contrast to the rest of the United Kingdom. However, they did have a referendum as well in 2014, and that ultimately showed that the majority of the Scottish want to stay in the United Kingdom. Another one is in the 1990s. There were regional independence movements outside of Scotland, but also including Scotland. We'll go through all of them. So we had one in Wales that had the Party of Wales that advocated for Welsh independence and greater autonomy. It emphasized, cultural identity. I mean, look how long Welsh is, too. Linguistic rights and economic self-determination. In Northern Ireland, we see nationalist parties that campaign for the reunification of Ireland and an end to the British rule in the region. So what they see is not only separation from the United Kingdom, but also rejoining with Ireland. If you don't know, Ireland and Northern Ireland are separate entities. Ireland is a country. Northern Ireland is a region in the United Kingdom. And this movement has particularly been shaped by what's known as the Troubles, which is a conflict between Catholic nationalists who seek closer ties to the country of Ireland and strong independence from British rule, but there's also Protestant unionists. So it's a Catholic versus Protestant battle, essentially. The Protestants identify more with Northern Ireland and remaining part of the UK. In Scotland, of course, we have the Scottish Nationalist Party, as well, which is, pretty important. But the Scottish Nationalist Party is the one that you'll probably see most likely on the AP exam. And they've gained, of course, momentum throughout the decades, and they culminated the establishment of the Scottish Parliament in 1999. And then, of course, they had that referendum in 2014. So there's been certain measures taken in place as a result of these movements. So, yeah. We also have the Occupy movement that's there to regulate banking and wealth redistribution. They aim to challenge economic inequalities. They want to distribute wealth equally across the country. They also want to have corporate influence in politics and perceived excess in the financial sector. They've put in Occupy camps, and they've put in protests across the different cities of the United Kingdom, such as London and Manchester. These are very prominent cities, particularly London, which is a financial hub, a global financial hub. And the activists here call for greater regulation of the banks, wealth redistribution, and social justice reforms. It did not achieve all of its stated goals, but it did succeed in, of course, bringing in awareness and speaking of their ideologies to others people. They really diffused what they are trying to work for. They didn't just go down and people were like, who are they? I don't remember them. And it prompted public debate over finance and policy in society. There's also been an LGBT movement for gay rights and marriage within the past decades or so. This is common throughout the world. It's led to various reforms and decriminalization, such as homosexuality decriminalization in England and Wales in 1967, and civil partnerships in 2004, and the passage of the Same-Sex Couples Act in 2013. So it's had some successes. We also see the Black Lives Matter movement that's very recent as well, focusing on ending racial discrimination, reforming the education system, and ending racial health disparities. It's advocated for reforms to laws, policies, and practices that perpetrate inequality and discrimination. It's called for a more inclusive educational curriculum that accurately reflects the diverse histories, experiences, and contribution of Black and minority ethnic communities. And of course, they've advocated for improving access to health care for Black individuals and addressing social determinants of health for Black individuals as well. They're trying to raise that standard of living for Black individuals as well in the country. That's kind of a big part of their movement. Now let's move on to Russia. So we see grassroots movements that have organized around environmental issues, both at the local and regional level, particularly regarding clean water, air pollution, and waste disposal. They're organized primarily by citizens, but also particular groups and activist communities. We also see the Left Front, which is a movement against globalization. It's a coalition of leftist organizations and activists in Russia, including socialists, communists, and others. So these can be very radical individuals. They've concluded demonstrations against multiple multinational corporations. So those are organizations like Apple that are prominent in a variety of countries and have really connected the world together. Because, I can see someone with an iPhone in Russia. I can see someone with an iPhone in America and in Mexico. I can see people with iPhones in Australia. They're everywhere. These left-front demonstrations have also been against international financial institutions, as well as trade agreements that connect various countries together. They're globalizing society. And we'll get into globalization more in the next unit. And other manifestations of a global economic system, global capitalism. There's also a movement to ban hostels in order to stop, restrict, or regulate urban development in Moscow. Moscow has been seeing a lot of urban growth and population incoming to the city, and there's been movements to try to regulate this development. So they're banning hostels. Hostels are budget accommodations for travelers, and they've proliferated in the past few years, leading to concerns about their impact on residential neighborhoods, housing affordability, and quality of life for local residents. The movement calls for measures to limit this, regulate the operation, and protect residential areas from negative impacts such as tourism and transient populations. Alright, we have an important one coming up here. First, we have the Federation of Independent Trade Unions. It's a labor organization, and they work for what you would think a labor organization would work for: better pay, benefits, and pensions across industries. They've engaged in collective bargaining with employers. They've lobbied government authorities for labor reforms and provide representation for workers in disputes with their employers, because they're not always going to get along. Have you seen SpongeBob, Squidward, and Mr. Krabs? Don't get along in every single situation. There's also an LGBT gay pride movement for gay rights and marriage equality in the country. They advocate for various issues such as anti-discrimination laws, legal recognition of same-sex relationships, protection from hate crimes, access to health care, and the right to express one's gender identity and sexuality open in public without fear of prosecution or harassment. There's been an implementation of laws such as the gay propaganda law, which effectively bans the promotion of non-traditional sexual relationships to minors, leading to increased censorships and restrictions on LGBT advocacy and visibility. Now, there's a lot more to this law than I've described here, and I probably should have rewritten this a little differently here. So, what this law essentially does is they will not show gay relationships to minors, such as in the education system, or if you have a minor dedicated good like a toy, you can't show that within the country. And this has been perceived by individuals as increased censorship and restrictions on LGBT visibility in Russian society. Very, very controversial, very highly debated. I recommend, looking into some of these movements, whether this one or another one. It could be the Federation of Independent Trade Unions, if you find that interesting. We also have some other Russian movements. We're not done yet. We have the March of Millions that was there to protest election fraud. It gained momentum in response to Russian parliamentary and presidential election frauds, particularly in 2011 to 2012. They were really looking at irregularities and that's not right. That's fraudulent. It was met with heavy-handed response from the government. They did not like this, and they arrested protesters. There was police violence and crackdowns on this opposition, and it did not achieve its immediate goals on electoral reform. But, of course, it brought awareness and widespread advocacy for public dissatisfaction with the elections and the political system. All right, let's move on to China. We see Minyan, which is a Chinese democracy movement that works to encourage democracy, and it works to advocate against authoritarianism. It advocates for political reform, democratization, and protection of human rights. They have activists that includes intellectuals, students, and descendants that promote the ideals such as freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, multi-party democracy, and rule of law, all of which you would expect to see in a democratic society, all of which you don't see in China. They've faced severe repression from the government with no surprise. They've seen harassment, surveillance by the government, arrests, and imprisonment for their advocacy and organization efforts. And of course, they haven't seen really any big successes either. There's also the umbrella movement that's also been promotive of democracy, independence, and autonomy, but for Hong Kong, a region within China. So for this course and many other courses in life, Hong Kong is a part of China. It's not considered its own country. And the Umbrella Movement took place in 2014. It was also known as the Occupy Central Movement. And there were protests that were primarily the youth. They were students for the most part that called for genuine universal suffrage in Hong Kong that was free from interference by the Chinese government. They wanted autonomy and sovereignty within the Hong Kong territory. They wanted to be outside Chinese influence and power, essentially be its own country. The movement adapted the use of umbrellas as a metaphor, a symbol of peaceful resistance against police tear gas and pepper spray during the protests. They were showing they were unarmed. We are not violent. And it did not achieve its immediate goals, who would have thought, but it drew international attention, which is very good, due to the erosion of democratic freedoms and autonomy that were taking place in Hong Kong. So this is a cool picture of here. Look at all those umbrellas here. They really brought people together within Hong Kong. This is actually just a really cool picture too. You can find many more of them online. We also see the new citizens movement that fights against corruption. It advocates for measures to combat political corruption, promotes civic engagement among the people, and protect the rights of marginalized groups such as migrant workers and petitioners. There's also a movement for an independent Tibet, which is a region within China as well. They want more autonomy and independence from the rest of the country. They have religious differences, language differences, and ultimately cultural differences between the Tibetan people and the majority of the Eastern Chinese people in the country. They seek to challenge Chinese rule within Tibet. They view it as oppressive and illegitimate. They see it as unneeded. They can have their own autonomy and political system. There's also an LGBT movement for gay rights and anti-discrimination, and it's made some strides in recent years with increased visibility and awareness, and obviously support for LGBT rights. There's still been a variety of challenges, again, because we're talking about China, and because it's still a newer movement and still gaining momentum, and they've seen censorship, social conservatism, and government repression. We see a Greenpeace movement, which is an environmental group that works to clean up the environment and promote environmental sustainability. They've organized protests and campaigns and initiatives to promote the use of renewable energy and reduce pollution and protect the endangered ecosystems in China. Remember, China is a very, very, very industrializing country. They have a lot of factories that emit a lot of pollution, and they use a lot of fossil fuels. And this group here is trying to recognize that and switch it over to more renewable and sustainable ways of development. We also see a religious movement known as Falun Gong. It's a spiritual practice that combines meditation, certain exercises, and moral teachings based on certain principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. It's very similar, at least in my eyes, to Buddhism, which is a very prominent, not so prominent as in other countries, but it's probably one of the most prominent religious groups within China. Certainly not the majority of people in China are Buddhist, but it is you can find people who are Buddhist within China. And that's thanks to the proximity that it has to where Buddhism was originally started in South Asia. And you actually look up some cool Buddhist temples within China. It very so matches the Chinese architecture there. This movement gained popularity in China in the 1990s, but it was banned by the government in 1999 as they cracked down on practitioners and accusations of destabilization within the country of this movement. In Nigeria, we see the Labor Congress, which is the NLC. They work for better wages, benefits, and better infrastructure. It's a very, very prominent labor union within Nigeria, and they advocate for the rights and welfare and well-being of workers. We see a separatist movement in Nigeria, in the southeastern region, for the actualization of the sovereign state of Biafra. And this traces roots back to the Nigerian Civil War in the late 60s, where this group attempted to secede from Nigeria during this time. And this led to even more conflict that led to widespread devastation and death. Now they seek to bring back that struggle for their independence. They have grievances such as marginalization, political exclusion from the rest of the country, and economic inequality faced by the Igbo ethnic group and other people within the region. They say that they don't fit in with the Nigerian country as a whole. They want their own country that they could fit in with. We also see Occupy Nigeria that works against the elimination of subsidies for gas and food. It's a socio-political movement that's emerged very recently in response to the government's attempt to eliminate fuel subsidies in 2012. It's mobilized mass protests and demonstrations against the removal of subsidies on essential commodities because they believe that it would result in economic downfall, increased prices with inflations, and it wouldn't be sustainable for their economy. All right, we see an important one coming up here. MEND. It works on issues such as the environment, local autonomy, and control of oil and indigenous rights. It's a militant group, though, so that's very important. Militant group. There's a picture of it. They have weapons. They are armed, and they're found in Nigeria's oil-rich Niger Delta region. They advocate for environmental justice, local autonomy, and greater control of oil resources by indigenous communities. They're recognized by the government as pretty much a terrorist organization now. And they've emerged very recently due to environmental change and economic exploitation and governmental neglect. And particularly, this is very important, the multinational oil corporations that operate within Nigeria that can hurt domestic business and indigenous communities. And they have engaged in acts of sabotage, pipeline vandalism, and armed protesting. And I don't know what vandalizing the pipelines would actually do to help their cause by making conditions worse, but that's what they've been doing. We see the Bring Back the Girls movement, as we discussed earlier. It emphasizes the government's reaction to the kidnapping of schoolgirls by the Muslim terrorist organization Boko Haram. We also see the Not Too Young to Run movement that works to lower the age requirement to run for president from 40 to 35. They seek to promote more youth inclusion and participation in their politics, address generational leadership gaps, and foster democratic governance in Nigeria by allowing younger candidates to contest elections and contribute to the nation building in the political system, in policy making, and say so within the country. Because young people, they're more up to date on what's affecting the youth within society, such as the educational systems. 70-year-old people in the political system don't know what's going on in schools as much and don't know how that's going to be changing. They may know more about the healthcare or the overall economic state of the country because they have more experience in that, or that's affecting them to a greater amount. So they're trying to foster more diversity in age cohorts within their political system with this movement. Okay, we're going to move on from social movements now to interest groups, which are a little bit different. So social movements represent multiple groups and individuals advocating for a particularly broad social change. Interest groups are explicitly organized to represent and advocate for a very, very specific interest, very specific policy issue. They play a significant role in shaping public policy, influencing decision-making processes, and representing the interests of specific sectors or constituencies within society. So social movements, for the most part, are more broad. Interest groups are a little more specific. So, for example, in Mexico, we see the Business Coordinating Council that represents the interests of business associations and chambers of commerce. They advocate for policies that promote economic growth, investment, and competitiveness that would boost their economy. In Nigeria, we see the Manufacturers Association of Nigeria that represents the issues of Nigerian manufacturers and industrial. It's a very specific field. They advocate for policies that support local production because that's going to earn them the most money. They also want to see industrial development, which will increase their economy, and trade promotion as well. That can limit their economic costs and bring in more profits. So there's a variety of roles of interest groups that you should be familiar with. So they advocate and lobby to influence government officials and policies. They represent members and constituents on the behalf of citizens. They conduct research and studies on certain issues and subjects. They can say, okay, increase taxes, but increase taxes to this amount based on blank study, blank study, blank study. They can engage in political demonstrations, such as protests, and gain public opinion and support. They can monitor government actions and policy that they're passing to hold them accountable and make sure that they're remaining transparent. They can engage in negotiation and compromise between various organizations, policymakers, and opponents to achieve their desired objectives. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe. It's free, which means it costs $0, and it really does help me out. Leave a comment down below with any questions. I'll be happy to answer them. There's some links down below in the description with practice tests, key terms, guided notes, all that fun stuff. Head on over to the next AP Comparative video on some really cool political stuff.